Now I found a movie about two things I love. So I'm going to see you very soon.
Oh boy, it's 2023, the year the Rogue Squadron movie is supposed to come out. Now time to look at my computer for no particular reason. Well, looks like I'm not getting my Rogue Squadron fix this year. That makes this year 20. Looks like I'll have to make it myself. So for all of you, and admittedly for myself, today I'm going to go through the history of Rogue Squadron. It'll be a salute to all things Rogue Squadron, but mostly the video games. We first hear the name Rogue Group in The Empire Strikes Back during the Battle of Hoth, led by Luke Skywalker as Rogue Leader, followed by Wedge Antilles, another Battle of Yavin survivor, as Rogue 2. As the Imperials closed in on Echo Base and the shield generator, Rogue Group sought to hold them back and buy the rebels time to escape. Then, in the mid-1990s, things really got kicked off. After the success of the Thrawn trilogy of Star Wars novels and the X-Wing video games, Michael Stackpole wrote Star Wars X-Wing Rogue Squadron, the first in a series of novels taking place after Return of the Jedi, focusing on Wedge Antilles reforming Rogue Squadron, recruiting new pilots, and taking on the Imperial Remnant in hopes of taking back the capital world of Coruscant. This also followed with a comic book series by the same name. The books and comics were, and are to this day, beloved. It was also with this media sphere where the central idea of Rogue Squadron cemented itself. That being, Rogue Squadron is the elite team of pilots taking on the most difficult missions for the Alliance, and overcoming seemingly impossible odds time and time again. This sets us up, of course, for the video games, which is also the part that I'm the most excited to talk about. But in order to do that, we need to go back. In 1982, George Lucas founded Lucasfilm Games with cooperation and funding from Atari. However, one of the caveats of this deal was that Lucasfilm Games did not have the rights to make Star Wars games. Atari did. This allowed Lucasfilm Games to find their own creative footing and soon became a beloved developer. Their first games included a future sports game called Ball Blazer and a flight game called Escape from Fractalus for the Atari 8-bit line of computers. Now, you might be thinking, are you really just going to go through the entire history of these companies just for the sake of dragging this out? But no, this stuff is directly relevant. Lucasfilm Games' distributor in Germany was at one point Rainbow Arts. If you're unfamiliar with them, Rainbow Arts was a huge name in the European video game scene, functioning as both a developer and publisher who also had various other development teams branch off of them, including, of course, Factor 5, the developers who would later make the Rogue Squadron games. Factor 5 wanted to make a Fractalus sequel for the Commodore Amiga called Return to Fractalus, but found that the higher resolution created issues and they pulled the project. However, the remains of those experiments can be found in the opening to Rainbow Arts' Amiga sequel to Ball Blazer, Master Blazer. So yes, the desire within Factor 5 to make an open landscape-driven flight game existed back in 1990. This right here is the first test to create the game that would evolve into Rogue Squadron. Meanwhile, Factor 5 was riding high off the success of the Turrican series. If you want to know more about those games, watch this video. I can't recommend these games enough. This allowed them to do work with other big names like Hudson Soft and Konami, doing ports of their games, like a shockingly intact port of Contra 3 to the Game Boy. If it wasn't clear already, Factor 5 was completely insane in the best possible way. So with Factor 5 partnering up with other companies and LucasArts being big fans of Turrican, it was only a matter of time before they worked far more closely. Quite literally, as it turns out, as they moved from Germany to the US to simplify development and communication. One thing that wasn't allowed to happen, though, was that LucasArts couldn't flat out buy Factor 5.
The good thing about George Lucas was that he forbade essentially buyouts of his subsidiaries of smaller developers. Because otherwise, of course, LucasArts would have just gobbled us up.
Factor 5 made Indiana Jones's Greatest Adventures for the Super Nintendo, as well as a couple of PlayStation games, an enhanced port of Star Wars Rebel Assault 2, and a new sequel to Ball Blazer called Ball Blazer Champions. However, Factor 5 wasn't satisfied with the PS1.
I really didn't like the look of the PS1's polygons, because it didn't have a filter in the chip, it didn't have perspective correctness. And I mean, if you look at PS1 games nowadays, except for very few, they really look rough.
So they looked to make subsequent games on the Nintendo 64, starting with another project with a Lucas IP, Return to Fractalus. That's right, it's back again. LucasArts also had a deal with Nintendo where they needed to release 3 Star Wars games on the N64. They would actually release 4. Shadows of the Empire was done, Episode 1 Racer was already decided upon, they just needed one more. Hey, we have this sci-fi flight game in development, let's just take that and set it in Star Wars. Given that Factor 5 were hardcore Star Wars fans and they wanted to make a Star Wars game for ages, this was a perfect chocolate and peanut butter situation. Factor 5 wanted to make a game where you play as Wedge Antilles, the pilot who was introduced in A New Hope and survived the entire trilogy, and play through every battle of the original trilogy, while also drawing influence from the Atari Vector Star Wars arcade games. However, LucasArts didn't just want to constantly rehash the movies, so they asked Factor 5 to go back to the drawing board. At that point, Factor 5 looked to the X-Wing Rogue Squadron comic series, and they found the perfect angle to work with. What wasn't perfect was the Nintendo 64 hardware itself. The Nintendo 64 was a strange console. The idea was to, in spirit, cram a high-end Silicon Graphics workstation computer into a low-end consumer game console. However, because the Silicon Graphics team was used to making high-end workstation computers, they were unprepared to make something of such a limited scale. The Nintendo 64 had a lot of design issues. The RAM was an issue, as the N64 used generalized RAM, not dedicated RAM. On top of that, the N64 didn't have its own sound card, meaning the sound needed to come through the CPU. Latency was a problem, performance was a problem, the development environment was also a huge problem. So much so that Factor 5, seeing the sheer anguish other N64 developers were going through, took a different route.
I reached out to our old friends SN Systems, who actually nowadays are part of Sony, and who built the PlayStation development kits back then. And I reached out to SN at the time and said, hey guys, do you happen to have a development kit for the N64 in development? And they said, well, we can't really talk about it yet, but funny that you ask, yes, we do.
So, crisis averted, right? Wrong. The N64 was still an utter pain to make games for. Rogue Squadron's development was rough, and the game still wasn't taking shape. It wasn't until the last few months where things really started to click, but that still wasn't the end of their problems. Factor 5 was also using the expansion pack, which was meant more for giving extra memory for debugging purposes. So Factor 5 had to figure out how to get the game to run with half the RAM on a system that was notorious for eating it, while Nintendo breathed down their necks to make sure that they did it. However, Turok 2 Seeds of Evil was able to hit the mark with expansion pack enhancements, such as increased resolution if the player was to have it. So now, after Factor 5 got Rogue Squadron working with 4 megabytes of RAM for the base N64, they were allowed to take advantage of the expansion pack. Rogue Squadron was released for the N64 on December 7th, 1998, and not only was it up against the likes of Turok 2, but also Ocarina of Time. Despite this, the game did well. Like, really well. Julian Egerbrecht said it sold about 100 times better than anybody expected, and if you live in North America like I do, if you're aware of Factor 5, chances are it's because of this game and its sequels. Myself included. So given the game's origins, there is a base resemblance to Fractalus. You're in a ship and you fly through landscapes. However, the game ended up being very much its own thing. Instead of just flying around the surface and rescuing people, you have a variety of different mission objectives, protecting convoys, searching for and destroying Imperial factories, disabling key targets, and flying around a surface and rescuing people. Wait. Another key aspect to Rogue Squadron is that usually more than one objective is happening at once. The game will push and pull you in different directions, and you need to decide the best path to victory. There is a strong emphasis on strategy, and staying calm under pressure is the key here. The The game does a really good job of making the situation you're in very clear, but it's up to you to take the variables the game throws at you and put them into order. On top of the simulation and strategy elements, you also have an arcade bend thrown into the mix too. The controls are very approachable and simple. The game aims to be as approachable and pick up and play as possible, so that way it doesn't need to bog you down in, press the A button to do this! Or, press the B button to do that! Whoa! Which gives the game more of an immersive edge. Missions are often pretty short, around 5 minutes on average. After each mission, you are given medals based on your performance. There are bronze, silver, and gold, and getting enough of these will earn you extra missions and promotions. There's a huge emphasis on not just getting through stages, but replaying and perfecting them. The various criteria for medals are very clearly laid out, so you're not left there wondering what you did wrong. You know it, and when trying again, you know exactly what to focus on. You can also use a variety of ships with different strengths and weaknesses that may aid in compensating for those deficiencies. There are ship upgrades hidden in the levels, which aid in not only upgrading your ship, but also scoring medals. However, they're also out of the way, so you have to be smart about how and when you go about collecting them. So this is a very well crafted game that manages to feel very unique due to the various genre elements at play here. However, on top of that, another thing that caught notice at the time was the presentation. This game looked absolutely insane for the Nintendo 64. Like, just to give an idea of how much it did, here's Star Fox 64, not only a flight game on the same system, but a rail shooter with far less freedom of the camera. Thus, the game can put the N64's full firepower into what's visible and nothing more. If anything, Star Fox 64 should have the clear advantage here. But here's Rogue Squadron. Look at that texture detail. Look at the lighting. Every laser blast casts light on the world around it.
Did you guys ever consider like taking out the dynamic lighting or some of the effects that you guys used?
No.
No?
Speaking of stuff not being cut out, there are a ton of extras here. You not only have 3 unlockable missions you earn through getting bronze, silver, and gold medals on every mission in the game, but you also have unlockable ships like the Millennium Falcon, TIE Interceptor, and the Naboo N1 Starfighter from the then upcoming Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace. It was hidden in the game's code to the point where cheat devices couldn't find it. Then, when The Phantom Menace was released, they released the passwords to unlock the ship. Speaking of cheat codes, you can enter a little arena where you play as an AT-ST and shoot down everything. You can also alter the main menu to replace Luke with members of the development team. And you can also gain access to the ultimate ship, a 1969 Buick. This is the baby of sound designer Rudolf Stemberg, hence why it's often listed as Rudy's car in cheat code books and magazines, and this isn't the last you'll see of it. Then there's the sound. The music was done by Chris Hulsbeck, who Factor 5 had worked with previously on their conversion of R-Type to the Amiga and the aforementioned Turrican series. And if you haven't heard the music in the Turrican games, you are doing your ears a disservice. Needless to say that Chris Hulsbeck is very good at what he does. He is also a huge Star Wars and John Williams fan, so when he was given the offer, he also moved to the US to work on this Star Wars game. It's quite the shift to go from the electric bombast of his prior work to the more romantic Wagnerian style of Williams. However, Chris Hulsbeck stuck the landing. His work here is genuinely fantastic and demonstrates his range as a composer. So the music is great, the sound effects are authentic, and the voice acting is shockingly plentiful. Factor 5 used their own sound compression technology, which allowed for a lot of voice acting and sound effects. This earned them a lot of attention from other Nintendo 64 developers, who either utilized their technology or outright commissioned Factor 5's lead sound people for their projects. Keep this in mind because it's going to be important later. There was also a port of the game to the PC called Rogue Squadron 3D. It's a pretty straightforward port and not all that different from the N64 version. You can play it at higher resolutions and the frame rate is smoother, which is nice, though on modern computers you get this really annoying camera glitch until you switch to a different camera angle. The AI is also less ruthless and more prone to just crashing into the ground. Instead of having an ATST shooting arena, you can instead play through the regular levels as an ATST, even though the levels were very clearly not designed for it. And most tragically of all, there's no Buick, though there are fan mods like Rogue Car to restore it. Overall, this port is a downgrade, and the game is best played on a Nintendo 64, though you can get it on Steam and GOG, so if that's the more convenient option, then by all means go for it. Just 2 years later, we had a spiritual successor to Rogue Squadron on N64 and PC called Star Wars Episode 1 Battle for Naboo. I'm going to keep this brief because this is a video about Rogue Squadron, not Bravo Team. And if I were to go into all of Factor 5's flight games that have this gameplay style, I'd also have to talk about Lair, and that deserves its own separate video because there's a lot to talk about. In short, it's really not that bad. People are really unfair to it. Battle for Naboo follows the same gameplay mold as Rogue Squadron, but tries to expand it in a few ways. You not only have air vehicles, but also ground ones, like land speeders, and can switch between them mid-mission at will if you can find a hangar. The game also introduces space battles to the formula. It's kind of funny how this game established some of the key gameplay hooks of the next 2 games in the series. The other thing that's of note here is the presentation. This game looks ridiculous for the N64, easily one of the best looking games on the system by far, and it even expands the draw distance considerably. Also, this game is not only fully voice acted like the last game, but also includes audio commentary from the developers on top of that. Man, they were really pushing that voice compression technology, huh? Well, Nintendo took notice of Factor 5's technical expertise, especially with sound, and thus they were brought on board to work on the audio for Nintendo's next console, the GameCube. This put Factor 5 in an interesting situation as a game developer. No longer did they need to give game consoles to the German Secret Service to have them reverse engineered like with the Super Nintendo. No longer did they need to call up companies with alternative development kits due to the shoddiness of the official ones like with the N64. With the GameCube, they were at the table while this thing was being made. So more than ever before, they were in a position to push the system and push it hard. Within 19 days, they made a demo for Space World for the first look at the Nintendo GameCube and what it had to offer. And yet, it was set alongside pre-rendered videos for a variety of games, some of which never even came out.
And everybody thought it was fake, just like all the other ones, because the other ones were all pre-rendered. I was blown away that nobody had a real-time demo.
Short deadlines became something of a running theme for this game, as it was a GameCube launch title, and thus had to be done within 9 months. But nonetheless, throughout its short development, Rogue Squadron 2 took up a lot of notice just from its sheer graphical fidelity. Then when the game finally came out, it flabbergasted people. Even in comparison to the other 6th-gen titles that were coming out around the time, this game looked like it was from the future. It basically looked like it was a generation ahead of the competition. So yes, it's a very pretty game that replicated the look of the movies absurdly well. However, how is it as a game? Well, the core fundamentals of the game are the same as the first game. It's the same strategy, action, freeform flight arcade action that you love from the first game, but this time it's streamlined a lot. A lot of the superfluous mechanics like changing fire rate got cut, and this game is even more intuitive than before. It also adds the targeting computer, which helps you see and differentiate targets and things to defend. You also no longer lose a life every time you fail a mission, which is good because I always thought that was kind of dumb. The pacing is also a lot tighter. There's less navigating labyrinthine canyons and more blasting things to Kingdom Come. This game has a large emphasis on space battles, and with it comes fighting against capital ships. Also, like in Battle for Naboo, you can change crafts mid-mission, though it's more situational here. However, something this game does genuinely bring to the table is the command cross. You have 2 wingmen and you can assign them orders, from staying on your formation, to attacking guns, TIE fighters, or if you want to be the one who destroys everything, you can tell them to retreat. You can also command the ground troops and tell them to be more offensive or defensive. Another thing is that this game is far more rooted in the movies, with you playing through the climactic ship battles of the original trilogy with some new battles in between. While you start off playing as Luke Skywalker, you play most of the game as Wedge Antilles, and coolest of all is that they got Dennis Lawson, the actor who played Wedge in the movies, to reprise his role here. You might have also noticed that this sounds remarkably like the game they originally wanted Rogue Squadron to be, and you'd be right. If anything, them being told no allowed it to be even better with their game development experience and new technology. These are still, in my book, the best video game versions of these battles. And you know your game is going to be a blast when you kick things off with the best Death Star assault ever in a video game. Though, if you want to take things slower, the game also introduces Tatooine training, which gives you a map to explore, get used to the controls and concepts, and take on smaller challenges. It even changes the lighting based on what the time of day is while you play. Another use of the GameCube's clock is in the level Imperial Academy heist, where if you play it in the day, you play as a Y-Wing and is more of an action-based affair, whereas if you play it at night, it's more stealth-based. On top of that, you have a ton of extras. There are a ton of unlockable ships, and yes, the Buick makes a delightfully overpowered return. Look, you also have a monkey bobblehead, and the car radio is playing the Cantina band music. Not only that, but if you slow down, the song slows down, and if you speed up, the song speeds up. You can't tell me this is not the greatest thing ever. How am I breathing? You also have far more bonus missions than before, and the medal system has been reworked. You still get bronze, silver, and gold medals based on performance, but how much you die and how much you rely on the targeting computer are now criteria for them. The medals now give you points. Instead of needing to get medals on every single mission and unlocking missions accordingly, you spend your points to purchase each. This game gives you a lot more agency over what bonus missions you play and when, and thus makes them all the more enticing. You even get a couple of unlockable levels where you play as Darth Vader in an alternate timeline where he kills Luke Skywalker and the Imperials attack the Rebel base on Yavin. You also get an art hall, music hall, documentary, and audio commentary from the developers. So yes, this is a very good sequel. In fact, much like with Turrican, Rogue Squadron 2 is often seen as the best game in the series. While I honestly missed some of the aerial combat and exploration from the first game, along with the atmosphere and original story and so on, I will admit that this is a much tighter experience, and a lot of the changes to the formula made here are improvements. This game was a huge success. At launch, this game was a system seller for the GameCube, and helped combat the image of it being a kid's console. Despite this, Factor 5 were not going to rest on their laurels. Given Rogue Leader's short development, there were scenes from the movies they wanted to recreate, but just didn't have the time for. So in theory, development on the next game should be pretty simple, just build on top of Rogue Leader. That's not what they did. They built a new landscape engine to try to push the GameCube even more than they already did, including some really impressive lighting for the time. Of course, in doing this, they also underestimated how difficult and time-consuming the engine work was going to be. They also decided to push just how much could be crammed into those 1.4 gigabytes. This game wasn't just going to have one campaign, it would have two. One for Luke and one for Wedge, alongside more bonus missions than ever before. Not only would it have the extras that players of the prior games would come to expect, but it would also have the old Atari arcade games based on the original trilogy. For the first time in the series, they would make multiplayer modes, and boy did they go all out here. The game would have several versus modes, including dogfights, rampages, tag and defend missions, and races. Oh, and the last game we did? Yeah, let's just include a co-op version of that for good measure. Again, Factor 5 was completely insane in the best possible way. There would also be new gameplay additions in single player. There's a greater emphasis on ground vehicles like speeder bikes and walkers, but there would also be ground missions where you'd get out of your X-Wings and blast stormtroopers on foot. The initial inspiration behind these was Robotron 2084, which would be paired with cinematic camera angles a la Resident Evil or Devil May Cry. You can even see the more freeform aiming style in earlier trailers. However, this aiming system was largely cut out in favor of a lock-on system, though Tauntaun writing still remains quite Robotron-esque. Despite all of these features, the game was on store shelves by October 15th, 2003, less than 2 years since Rogue Leader's launch. Unfortunately, it didn't do as well as its predecessor, either commercially or critically. The GameCube was losing steam around this time, and support for it was drying up. The main point of contention was the on-foot missions, and it seemed whether or not people praised this game or denounced it was ultimately based on how heavily they weighed their importance. Personally, I don't think that they're particularly awful, but I also don't think they're typically that engaging. Battlefield Hoth is very much the exception here, given the hectic pacing and the variety of what you're doing. I don't think having on-foot combat in Rogue Squadron is a bad idea at all, but their execution doesn't really lean into the whole strategy element of these strategy arcade action games. I don't know, I feel like having the two modes interact with each other more, or throwing in some multitasking would go a long way to make things more unified. The flight missions are, of course, as good as ever. I also like that they're still experimenting here and pushing the envelope further. The mission Raid on Bakura has an alternate final section depending on your performance, which is such a cool idea and works really well here. The game is also drop-dead gorgeous. The GameCube's library, more than any other console, is one that I'm intimately familiar with, and to this day, these are still the best graphics I have ever seen on the system. Factor 5 maxed out the GameCube in pretty much every way possible here, and while it's more uneven than past installments, the additions that work here really work, and the stuff that already worked still works really damn well here. It's another really good game, and it also has some of the best multiplayer on the system, and keep in mind, this is the GameCube, so that's really saying something. The Rogue Squadron trilogy is one of those special and rare cases of a series where every game in it is excellent. Not decent, not good, but outstanding. These aren't just my favorite Star Wars games, these are some of my favorite games, period. It's just a shame we only have 3. True, Factor 5 also made Battle for Naboo and Lair very much in the same style, but we never really got that next step up, the next successor, and tragically, there were plans. The first of these was Dark Squadron. Remember in Rogue Leader how we had those what-if missions where you played as Darth Vader that took place in an alternate timeline? There were plans to make a full game out of that. Not just that, but you would be able to command not only wingmen, but capital ships. Though LucasArts rejected the pitch, so instead Factor 5 began working on a Rogue Squadron trilogy compilation for the Xbox. Though this too was cancelled. Though a new generation was on the horizon, so Factor 5 proposed Rogue Squadron, X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter for the Xbox 360. That title already sounds like a fever dream. However, this was going to have online competitive co-op with players acting out battles as both the Imperials and Rebels, while still adhering to the structure and style of the prior entries. This, of course, was too awesome to exist because we live amongst the damned, so it was also cancelled. Then Factor 5 pursued a deal with Sony, which included Lair, Animal Wars, Virus, Turrican Cyclone, but out of all of those, Lair was the only one that came out, and after that game failed, the contract was dropped. This allowed them to work on other platforms again, which led us to Rogue Leader's Rogue Squadron Wii. This is the one that was the closest to actually coming out, and was an enhanced compilation of the prior games. It supported every controller input the Wii offered, including a combination of the Wii wheel and balance board if you were feeling particularly insane. It provided expanded multiplayer modes, including a Wii Motion Plus lightsaber dueling mode. However, it didn't just include the missions from the prior games, but it combined them.
I still retain that I think you've done probably the best Battle of Hoth.
We did create the best Battle of Hoth by a long shot ever in a game, and nobody has ever played it except for my kids and a few testers at LucasArts, because actually in Rogue Wii, we merged together the Rogue Leader Battle of Hoth and the level which was actually on the ground partially and partially in the clouds in Rebel Strike, completely remixed the whole thing, and then put our next generation lighting engine and everything on there.
I want to play this so bad. Oh,
yeah, and it is.
Also, they didn't just remaster the previous soundtracks, they performed them with a live orchestra.
I think now so much time has passed that I can talk a little bit about it. The sad fact is that we had actually recorded music from all 3 Rogue Squadrons with a live orchestra at some point. And it never saw the light of day because of there was some project that was cancelled, and then Factor 5 went under eventually.
Yeah.
And it could have had a release on the Wii.
That's right, like a full
that never happened.
Like a new version with all 3 games on the Wii.
Yeah,
That would have been amazing. Yeah.
Orchestral recordings of all those tracks.
And as if that wasn't bad enough, it was finished! So why did this happen? Well, this wasn't exactly LucasArts' golden age, and while they approved the project, Factor 5 had to pay for it out of their own pocket. Also, at the same time, Factor 5 was working with Brash Entertainment on an open-world Superman game. However, Brash imploded spectacularly, leaving Factor 5 without money coming in. They were told by Legendary Pictures that they would foot the rest of the development bill, but then just left Factor 5 on hold. So Factor 5 was trying to look for other publishers to help bail them out, but there was one small problem. This was late 2008.
Of course, it's lower open expected, and we are expected to go lower right now off the 252-point decline that we have, of course, coming into it.
Sadly, as Factor 5 was trying to secure funding to no avail, they weren't able to cover their employees' health benefits, Christmas bonuses, or anything of the sort. Factor 5 then went bankrupt. Meanwhile, one of Julian Eggebrecht's business partners set up a new company to finish their existing projects, with many of the key people from Factor 5 being brought over, and this is where Rogue Squadron Wii was finished. It went through Nintendo QA and was ready to go, but not every Factor 5 employee was invited to the new venture, and the whole thing read as sketchy by many. This resulted, of course, in lawsuits, and neither LucasArts or Nintendo wanted to move forward due to the controversy. Since then, the prior employees have been reimbursed, and the legal troubles have been resolved. Many of the Factor 5 crew of old are now working at Epic, though Factor 5 was reformed in 2017 and began releasing Turrican entries under that name. Though, by all accounts, this is a side thing, and Eggebrecht and the others still have their day jobs. Also in 2017, Julian Eggebrecht said he wanted to finally release Rogue Squadron Wii on the Switch, but now it's all in the hands of the mouse whether or not that comes to pass. Though it's not out of the realm of possibility. Aspyr has been releasing a lot of the old Star Wars games from the 90s and 2000s on modern consoles, and upon being asked if they planned on re-releasing Rogue Squadron, they said it was just a matter of whether or not the demand is there or not. Julian Eggebrecht was quick to enter the chat. Since the Disney purchase and the scrubbing of the expanded universe, canon Rogue Squadron material has been sparse. They've appeared in a couple of comics, but not a lot more. Probably the most prominent appearance was in the campaign of Star Wars Squadrons.
Wedge Antilles, Rogue Squadron. I hear you're the reason I was able to finally get a comm through.
A game mechanically more inspired by the X-Wing games, but the Rogue Squadron influence on this game is very blatant. The mission structure in the campaign is very much in line with the Rogue games, and you also have a multiplayer mode where you play as either the Imperials or Rebels carrying out objectives and missions, and wait a minute, this sounds a lot like Rogue Squadron X-Wing vs TIE Fighter. Also in 2020, it was announced that Patty Jenkins was working on a Rogue Squadron movie. A teaser was shown with her describing how her father was a fighter pilot and how she wanted to capture the feeling of thrill and exhilaration that embodied. She also said that the film would indeed take influence from the books and video games. This got a lot of people excited, and the film was marked for 2023 before it being indefinitely delayed. At first, everyone took this to mean it was cancelled, but after I started writing this script, she made a statement saying that no, it is still in the works, so who knows how things will turn out, though I still remain hopeful that in one way or another we will see the Rogues in action again.